This is RadioFire.com. Yours truly, Dominic K, in here alongside my father. How you doing, Dad?
Fine.
We got special guests in the building also. I'm excited about talking to him. Before we do that, today's broadcast is brought to you in part by Flywire's 2018 White Tie Affair. This red carpet VIP gala will take place in one of Baltimore's most beloved landmarks, Druid Hill Park, Sunday, June the 10th, 5 to 10 p.m. at the Parks Mansion House Lawn. For more information, visit RadioFire.com or Facebook.com/the-Flywire. All right. How's it going?
Good.
A lot of things
Great.
going on.
Yeah.
Election season. I love election season,
No, I don't think.
especially if I'm not running for anything. It is very it's good for me. But we have a special guest who does not have the luxury of just kicking back like me because he is in campaign mode. Please introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you so much. My name is Thiru Vignarajah, and I'm running for state's attorney. And I consider it a privilege to run. It's been really fun to get out there, but it is election season. You're right about that.
Elections can be what's the word? You know, they say boxing is like a sweet science. It's like it can be back and forth. How has it been for you?
It's been good. Everybody is talking about crime. The city is in a real state of perpetual crisis these last couple of years.
Agreed.
And that means that people are paying attention. They want to talk about the issues, and that's been a really gratifying part of the campaign. We're out there every day talking to people on radio stations like this one, but also in community centers, in church basements, and I think people are realizing that this election is a very important one, perhaps the most important in a generation, because the state's attorney, I think, has more influence over whether crime goes up or whether crime goes down than just about anyone, and that's why I'm running.
I haven't heard that one said like that. Why do you say that you have more influence, state's attorney?
Well, I think people tend to blame the mayor or the police commissioner for what's happening with crime, but the reality is that these past 3 years, as I'm sure you know, we have had the worst murder surge in Baltimore history. More than 300 murders, 3 years in a row, and a lot of that has to do with what's happening at the state's attorney's office, because the state's attorney is not only responsible for prosecuting the cases that the police give them, they also give a lot of direction to police about what they can do, what they can't do when it comes to constitutional policing, but also direction about what kinds of strategies to deploy, the wiretap cases, the gang cases, the multi-defendant conspiracy cases. Those are the cases that the state's attorney is responsible for directing. I started my career as a federal prosecutor here in Baltimore, and then I was chief of major investigations in Baltimore City, and then most recently I was the deputy attorney general. And in each of those jobs, part of our responsibility was to lead. It was to say, these are areas that need attention. These are strategies that we need to try. These are particular violent repeat offenders that we need to bring to justice. And the state's attorney was responsible for making sure that everybody was on the same page, for bringing together the community, the police, the court system to make sure that the job was getting done.
Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Most people are naive when it comes to the function of the state's attorney, except they may think that the state's attorney works close with the police. You guys are like kissing cousins. So, and most people are mistrustful of the police in the community that you want to service.
And the last couple of years, we have given the community even more reason to mistrust the police. The police and the prosecutors are supposed to have a relationship that is built on mutual trust. And what that means to be a partner is to say sometimes we're not doing a good job. If a police officer comes to me and says, listen, I think I've built a good case together, but you're not taking it forward, we'd like to talk about that. That's a conversation that prosecutors have to be open to. At the same time, if the police are making mistakes, whether they're cutting corners or, as we've seen in recent days, committing crimes, that federal corruption trial was some of the worst examples of cops becoming robbers we've ever seen, not just in Baltimore, but across the country. And that is a circumstance where prosecutors have to not be afraid to hold police accountable. And it's telling that case was entirely done by federal prosecutors. One of the silver linings, if you can call it that, is that we saw an example of how police and prosecutors, federal prosecutors, local law enforcement, federal agents, all work together to build that case and to bring that case to a courtroom and to bring a measure of justice to all of the victims. But the state's attorney wasn't part of that case, and that was, I think, frustrating for a lot of us who were watching, because we thought those are the kinds of cases that the state's attorney is supposed to be leading, not sitting and watching from the sidelines.
Let me ask you this: the Freddie Gray situation.
Yeah.
The current state's attorney got a lot of credit from the community because they felt she stood up to the police department. I mean, what do you think? Where do you lie with that situation?
Yeah. I mean,
suppose you had been the state's attorney at that time. What would happen?
It's a really important question. The relationship between the community and the police ends up being defined in some ways by these high-profile cases, by these tragedies that unfold in a fatal encounter between police and citizens. I don't want to get in the business of second-guessing the judgment of a prosecutor on a particular case, because you don't know what they knew when they knew it. But if you're thinking about charging 6 people with conspiracy and murder based on a novel and untested legal theory, in a case that's going to be a referendum, not just for Baltimore City, but for the country, on whether we can hold police accountable, you simply cannot put that case together in 8 days. You can't do it. Now, the harder question, I think, is, because I've investigated and prosecuted complex cases. You got to dot your I's and cross your T's. You got to make sure everything is in order before you try to take that case into the crucible of a courtroom. But one of the harder questions is, well, what would you have done, Thiru, if you were in that situation and the city seemed like it was on the precipice of a real situation? What do you do then? And what I always say is, part of my job is to make sure that we keep the peace, but it's not just my job. I may very well have taken the steps of the War Memorial, but I wouldn't have done it alone. I would have done it with the police commissioner and the mayor and with the city council and with faith leaders and community activists. And I would have said, folks, my friends in Baltimore, we need your patience, because we need to make sure that we do this case right. And if there is sufficient evidence to bring charges, mark my word, I will announce those charges and I will lead that prosecution myself. And if there is not enough evidence to bring charges, you will hear that decision from me, and I will explain it as best I can, and you will hold me accountable for that decision. But either way, we need you, all of us on this stage need all of you to keep the peace, because the world is watching. And we want to show what justice looks like, and it's not a rush to judgment that shows what justice is. It's not 3 acquittals and 3 dismissals months later that people are looking for. They're not just looking for the courage to bring charges. They're looking for the courage to build the case that will stand up in a court of law, so we can get a real measure of justice.
Okay.
So, everybody that I've talked to lately about this seems like they said that the current state's attorney rushed to bring about the charges. Is that your?
Look, again, I genuinely don't want to say any particular decision was a right or wrong one, but if you're trying to put a case together in 8 days, some of the I's are not going to get dotted, some of the T's are not going to get crossed. And unfortunately, we saw that unfold in the courtroom and on television. Yeah. People were watching and following this case like no other. I talked to a lot of folks in West Baltimore and East Baltimore that were proud of the day that these charges were announced, but then their pride dissolved because they saw that the evidence that was promised on day one wasn't there in a court of law. The strategy that the state's attorney was claiming to have on day one wasn't there. And you had Judge Williams, a former prosecutor for the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, as proud an icon that Baltimore has, saying there was no evidence to support any of the charges against any of the defendants, resulting in 3 acquittals across the board, and then 3 dismissals a few months later. Nobody wanted to see that. If you don't have the evidence, don't bring the charges. If you bring the charges, make sure that you have a case that can stand up to the crucible of a courtroom.
But the majority of the time when police are brought on charges, they usually get away anyway. That's the perception of the community.
You know, that's the perception, but that's a perception we have to change.
I mean, even if it's camera footage of it, I think that a lot of people are frustrated because whether or not Marilyn Mosby brought about the charges too quickly or didn't have enough evidence, or there's video footage of something happening, the officers seemingly get off. Is that the fault of the system itself? Is that the attorney? Like, what do you think?
I mean, let me point out two things. You know, first, there have been 30 police-involved shootings since 2015. 12 of them were fatal. And Ms. Mosby has not brought any charges in any of those. So be clear, it's not like we are seeing the courage to bring charges in any other case besides Freddie Gray. But the other part of it is we have seen convictions. And I point to the federal case, not because it just happened, it did, but it's a really good illustration of what you have to do to build a case against any defendant, but certainly against a police officer. Because any prosecutor who's tried these cases knows that when you go before a jury is skeptical. They're built to be skeptical. Right. They have to put evidence sufficient to overcome the presumption of innocence and get a guilty verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. That's hard in any case. So if you're going to do that, you're going to need to put together the kind of evidence that's going to be subject to cross-examination, that's going to convince a jury. And in that federal trial, you saw wiretap evidence, you saw cooperators, you saw prosecutors working very closely with local law enforcement and federal agents day in and day out for months to bring that case together. When the Justice Department in DC brings these cases all across the country, they don't try to package it together in a week or two and then throw it into a courtroom and see what happens. They take their time to make sure that they have the evidence, and you don't always have that luxury. But you rush to judgment on a case of that kind of importance, and it not only doesn't deliver justice in a particular case, it undermines confidence even more in the system. There are people walking around all day that say you just can't convict them. And it took a federal case to start to showcase that actually you can, but you have to have the evidence.
That's true. What, in your opinion, we were talking about, or you mentioned it actually, the murder rate here and just crime in general. What do you think has caused this uptick in crime?
I think it's really important to understand what has happened in order to try to fix it. Because people should be aware that for 10 years, we had fewer and fewer arrests every year. We had fewer and fewer young black men incarcerated for petty offenses year after year. And during that 10-year period, we saw fewer shootings, fewer homicides, fewer carjackings, fewer armed robberies. So to your question, what happened in those last 3 years where we saw this abrupt, dramatic reversal of homicides? I think there's a couple of factors. The first one is that a lot of the prosecutors in the state's attorney's office left. Nearly half of the office, in an office of 200 prosecutors, just left over the last 2.5 years. It's the largest mass exodus of prosecutors in that office's history. That led to a predictable consequence, which was prosecutors were losing cases and dropping cases at rates that we'd never seen before. The Baltimore Sun reported that in 2016, the trial conviction rate, that is, the cases that actually went to trial, in 2016 for all of felony circuit court was 17%. Only 175 convictions total in all of Baltimore City in 2016 were secured at trial. That's unacceptable. But the other part of it, so you got prosecutors leaving, you got plummeting conviction rates, you've got very, very few trial convictions, but the other part of it is they're doing particularly badly on the cases that are most important. I went back and looked last year at gun cases. Ms. Mosby, my other opponents have been advocating for mandatory minimums. I came out and said mandatory minimums have failed us. We have seen the results from the 1980s. We need to turn the page. And so I went and looked at the cases where mandatory minimums were available, these gun cases where they had them. 2,200 cases were resolved by Ms. Mosby that she herself had indicted. 35% of those gun cases, she dropped 6 months after she indicted them because she doesn't count those. 2/3 of the cases that went to trial, these are cases from simple felon in possession all the way up to murder, 2/3 of the cases that went to trial resulted in an acquittal on every count. So those very, very serious cases, we are losing at unprecedented rates. And the last piece of the diagnosis in my mind is the proactive cases. I think I alluded to this at the very beginning. When I was a federal prosecutor, we did RICO cases in Baltimore City, these racketeering cases against gangs. I brought that approach to the Major Investigations Unit, which is responsible for going after the worst gangs, the most violent repeat offenders in Baltimore City. In my last year there, in 2014, we secured 14 cases involving multi-defendant indictments, violent drug organizations, gangs, under the Maryland Gang Statute, under the conspiracy laws of Maryland. In the past 3 years, Ms. Mosby's office has secured one. In April of 2016, she indicted 6 drug dealers. That's it. But those proactive cases are the ones that have really driven crime down. Can I give you one example?
Sure.
You guys know Greenmount Avenue, big north-south artery running through the heart of the city. 24th and Barclay was one of the most violent corners in all of Baltimore. If you drew a 5-block radius around 24th and Barclay, there were 52 homicides and shootings in that 5-block radius in the years preceding November of 2013. We brought the first of its kind Maryland Gang Statute case against the Black Guerrilla family in that particular neighborhood. For the next 18 months, that same 5-block radius that had 52 homicides and shootings didn't have a single murder, not one. Cherry Hill, similar case by federal prosecutors, 700 days without a shooting in Cherry Hill. Those are the cases that have really helped clean up neighborhoods, and those cases aren't happening anymore. And in fairness, they're hard cases.
Sure.
They take resources, they take prosecutors that are seasoned, they take people that are training and supervising them, they take innovation. I'm very proud of the career I've had. But before I was a federal prosecutor, before I was a city prosecutor, before I was deputy attorney general, I was a boy from Baltimore. My parents, you guys are father-son group. I brought my dad here to watch today. I grew up here. My parents are retired city school teachers. It was 1970 when my mom first came to teach at Poly. She finished her career at Morgan State. My father started teaching at Edmondson and then Douglas and then Southern. Before and after was Digital Harbor. And he just retired last year from Western. When he retired, he was the oldest teacher teaching in the state of Maryland. He was 80 years old. He's 81 now.
Wow.
He doesn't look it. He doesn't act it.
No, he doesn't.
But that is the tradition in which I was raised. It was about public service. It was about doing the hard work that is needed to get the job done, whether it's teaching kids in a classroom in West Baltimore, or whether it's building cases to bring criminals to justice, whether they're police officers or gang members. It's hard work, and it shouldn't be taken for granted.
So is that one of the reasons why you think that you are the best person for this job?
I do. I think that's part of it. I mean, Baltimore is in my blood. This is not a career move for me. It is my calling. This is the hardest job I will ever have, but there's no job I want more. After Woodlawn, I had a chance to do some, I think I mentioned, I went to Edmondson Heights Elementary. I graduated from Woodlawn High School, product of public schools myself. But I had a chance to do some amazing things after that. I went to Yale for college. I was at Harvard for law school. I was the president of the Harvard Law Review. I clerked on the U.S. Supreme Court. But the truth is that I didn't learn how to prosecute cases there. I learned how to prosecute cases in the federal and city courts of Baltimore. And I believe that I'm the best person for this job because at this moment of unprecedented violence, we need a prosecutor who's tried murder cases, who's tried wiretap cases, who's tried gang cases. I've been doing that my entire career. We had murders below 200 for the first time in decades, and it wasn't that long ago. We had the lowest homicide rates in Baltimore, modern Baltimore history, and it wasn't that long ago. We know the formula. We just need to get back to doing that stuff.
But in essence, what you're saying is that we're not arresting enough people.
Oh, I quite disagree.
No, he's saying we're not convicting enough people.
Okay.
Oh, and I think this is important, very important, because we were arresting fewer and fewer people while we were bringing homicides and shootings down. The strategies of mass incarceration, zero tolerance, mandatory minimums, life without parole for juveniles, I don't want any of that. My platform is actually pretty simple. We're going to cut murders in half in 3 years, and we're going to do it without mass incarceration. We're going to do it without zero tolerance. In fact, I want to create the most innovative, transparent, progressive prosecutor's office in American history. That means an office that will not use mandatory minimums, period. That will not seek cash bail, period. That will not seek life without parole for juveniles, period. That is, I think, what we have to do. And for too long, candidly, people have been making the assumption that you just made a moment ago. They say you can't do one without the other. I very much disagree. I think that the strategy that we need to deploy requires us to create both the most progressive prosecutor's office as well as to bring crime down. That's what Baltimore deserves. That's what it needs right now.
That sounds interesting. I don't understand how you're going to do that. But,
well, my opponents called it wildly unrealistic to cut murders in half in 3 years. And I always say two things. The first one is, first of all, we were 80% of the way there 4 years ago. But the other part is, people don't realize how off the charts we are. You're from Detroit originally. Mm-hmm. If we cut murders in half in Baltimore City, we would be almost as safe as Oakland, Milwaukee, Detroit. We are so off the charts that cutting murders in half isn't even that ambitious. But be clear, we put out a 5-part concrete plan for how you do it. Because everybody that runs for office, certainly everybody who talks about these things, they say the same things. Let's focus on violent repeat offenders. Let's invest in our youth. What I always ask is, what are the next 15 words? What are the next 150 words of how you take those aspirations, those principles, and you make them real? Well, my 5-part plan, Dan Rodricks, who has a podcast, called it a must listen. And I think the reason was because we weren't just talking about platitudes. We were talking about focusing on 11 neighborhoods in Baltimore City that have had 50 or more homicides and shootings. We were talking about matching community policing with community prosecution so that we can focus on particular neighborhoods and the prosecutors can learn those neighborhoods left and right, north and south. We're talking about making sure that we focus on high-impact prosecutions like burglaries and carjackings and serial murders. We're talking about reinvesting in reentry, actually taking prosecutors behind the walls, focusing on those at-risk inmates and saying, listen, gentlemen, we got some good news and we got some bad news for you. The bad news is that you are at greatest risk of being killed or killing someone else in the first year of your release. The good news is nobody in this room wants that to happen. So we're going to develop a comprehensive reentry plan for each and every one of you. Substance abuse assistance, expungement assistance, housing assistance, skills training, job placement. And be clear, I told myself when I decided to run that I wouldn't promise what I couldn't deliver, that I wouldn't overpromise. I can't solve the recidivism problem, the revolving door, right. But I can be the tip of the spear. I can take those 25 or 40 men each month and give them a path. And if we can find a path for them, the ones that are at greatest risk, then we are developing a model that we can use to other folks, that we can expand and apply to other folks. The last part of the plan is we have to divert resources from prosecuting victims of addiction and victims of trafficking for petty offenses and take those resources and focus them on prosecuting carjackings and burglaries. Because every time you prosecute a victim of heroin addiction for loitering in district court, make no mistake, you are making a tacit decision to take resources away from some circuit court prosecutor who doesn't have enough time to focus on the carjacking tomorrow. We got to change that. That's what I want to do.
When you were talking about prosecutors leaving Baltimore, are they retiring? Are they moving? What happened what caused this mass exodus?
Yeah, you should ask them. They have lots of stories to tell about what the state of the office is, and I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I think there are some patterns you can point to. One of the first things that Ms. Mosby did is she fired some people that had supported her opponent. I've taken a pledge that we will not make hiring or firing decisions based on your political allegiances. I actually think it's unconstitutional. You're a public employee, you're a career prosecutor. Who you vote for, who you support, what position you take, what faith you are has nothing to do with whether you're good in a courtroom, whether you're good with witnesses, whether you're good with law enforcement. I think that was a huge mistake, and it was something that was really unprecedented. Firing your deputies, I get that. You got to change your leadership. I understand that. But firing line prosecutors, career prosecutors that have devoted their entire lives, that put a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of people. And then you saw one day after the next, the wheels come off the wagon, and people didn't want to stay. And now they're doing all sorts of things. But that is an office that has to be the center of the fight against crime. And I want to build the best office in the country.
I mean, if you are elected, that's a regime change. So I mean, you're gonna want to change some things and some people, and if their mindset is different than yours, if they're overly loyal to the previous prosecutor, I mean, I could understand. Especially she's a first timer, correct?
Yeah.
And so she, coming into there, I'm sure that there was a lot of resistance she probably was getting. So if you were elected, you would not clean the closets around there?
I think it's really important not only to make it clear that I wouldn't do that, but I want to make it clear why. This is not a private business. It's a public institution. One of the sacrifices people make when they become teachers, when they become firefighters, when they become prosecutors, is that they don't believe that politics will bleed into their work. They don't get paid as much as what they could get in the private sector. But one of the promises they get from the Constitution is that their views, who they support in their private time, will not be a factor of their employment. And the Supreme Court has said, you want to take your deputy and you want to find a different deputy, that's fine. But these line prosecutors are public servants, and public servants have certain protections. I'm going to ask them to work really hard. And if they're not working really hard, we're going to have a hard conversation. I'm going to ask them to not seek mandatory minimums. I'm going to ask them to not prosecute victims of addiction for petty offenses. I'm going to ask them not to seek life without parole for juveniles. And if they don't get with the program in that respect, that's a fireable offense.
Sure.
But because they supported Miss Mosby, there's room in our office for great prosecutors that supported Miss Mosby. I think there are people of good faith that disagree about who has the best vision. That's not what I'm running on. I'm running on my ideas and my vision, but this isn't personal. And when you make it personal, you don't only corrupt the system, you give people the impression that it's more about personality and politics than about justice and getting the job done.
That's good. I think that Baltimore is going to have a hard decision to make, because he gives a good representation of himself.
He does.
I got a clear picture of what you want to do, and I feel the passion. That's the main thing.
I appreciate it, and it is a work of passion for me. I mean, this is not only my life's work, but I think the most important thing for Baltimore. I think it's an easy choice. I'm the only proven prosecutor. I've worked at the federal, state, and city level. I've actually tried murder cases and wiretap cases and gang cases. So I think it's a little easier choice, but I understand your point, and I really appreciate the time.
Your thing is going with the experience.
Yeah.
And you have a plan. What is your relationship like with the mayor?
I think that the mayor has a lot on her plate, and I have
Agreed.
and I respect her tremendously. I think she came in with a clear vision, and she is putting it into place. One of the things that I am most proud of when I see her is that she's constantly working. She's up before dawn, she's up after midnight, and that alone, I think, inspires a level of confidence that ought to hearten us. Are there some particular positions that she and I are going to disagree about? Probably.
Sure.
The mandatory minimum bill in Baltimore City. I wrote an op-ed that said, I don't think this is the solution for crime in Baltimore. She took a different position. But people in public service have to agree to disagree from time to time. I don't think that fundamentally undermines the partnership that I think has to be there. And I look forward to working with her and with the police commissioner and with the community and with faith leaders once I'm state's attorney.
Well said. We definitely need people to get out and vote. I think you said it well. This is probably the most important election of a generation, at least in this city.
Yeah. Crime has never been higher. Trust in police has never been lower. We are losing tens of thousands of families to the counties every year, and the biggest reason they cite is crime. We are losing small businesses and big businesses, and the biggest reason they cite is crime. If we don't reverse this, and we don't reverse this now, people said, why are you saying you're going to cut murders in half in 3 years? Why can't you be a little bit more patient? And I said, I don't know that we have 4 years to wait. Because if we don't reverse this now, the population will continue to dwindle. The tax base will continue to dwindle. And then the schools that you went at, Edmondson in the West Side is where my dad taught when we first got to this country. And those schools need money desperately.
Yes.
Those dollars are paid by taxpayers. And if they're in a different jurisdiction, it doesn't help us here in Baltimore City. June 26th is the primary. There's no Republican candidate, so the winner on June 26th will be the next state's attorney for Baltimore City.
We know
so
that.
please take a time to learn more about us. ThiruForBaltimore.com. I got to spell it. It's an uncommon name. It's THIRUFOR Baltimore. Thiru for Baltimore. I'm pretty easy to find, and you'll see me laying out all these positions, from cutting murders in half to getting rid of mandatory minimums to protecting immigrant communities. We got to do this, and we got to do it right.
And
Agreed.
they're accustomed to unusual names because Barack Obama got in office. So I think the timing is right for the right person to get in. So
It's a tough race.
yeah.
It was a tough race because
And how many murders did we have over the weekend? I mean, how many shootings did we have just this weekend?
Yeah, and every time I hear somebody say, well, we're having a pretty good year, let's put it in perspective. We're having a good year compared to last year, which was the worst year ever. We are having the second worst year in a decade. I often say we didn't have a good year, we had a good February. That's really the only statistical blip.
Cold.
That's right.
yeah, it was.
And the moment the sun came out, the guns came out.
Well, when I was growing up, I remember when the summer hit, it could get a little hectic, and when the weather breaks, a lot of times it that can happen. So I definitely wish you luck, I just, like Dad said, your passion is, you're oozing with the passion, and I definitely think that you're qualified.
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely qualified.
Look, that means a lot. There's a lot of places where they appoint the state's attorney. Baltimore City is a place where they elect the state's attorney, and I embrace that. I think it's important for people to hear my passion, my experience, and not just my story. I'm very proud of having this story that is rooted in Baltimore, but also my vision for Baltimore. We can turn this around. I sometimes remind myself that before I took an oath as a prosecutor, I made a pledge as a little boy. It's the same pledge we all took. We pledged allegiance. Every day at Edmondson Heights, all the way through Woodlawn High, pledged allegiance to a flag, to a nation united, to one nation, under God, indivisible, and justice for all. Justice for all. That's our slogan. That's why I'm running, and that's what I want to deliver.
And where's your family from?
Yeah, born in Sri Lanka, on the other side of the earth. They when we got here, we had $200. I guess they had $200 in their pockets and 2 infants in their arms. But Baltimore gave them a chance, and they have worked our entire lives to try to pay back the blessings we were given.
That's a good story to start with, So yeah,
It's a hell of a story.
That's a good story.
I know your dad's proud. I could see it. I could see it on his face.
We're proud of him.
I can recognize it because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you look at me the same way. However, the whole time we've been sitting here, he's had the same pride just oozing from his face. It's really nice.
It's incredibly nice of you to say.
I always tell them I have 2 brilliant children.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Definitely.
One of them is state attorney, the other one is going to be the governor of Maryland.
Well, that's good. 'Cause we need a governor. We need a governor. Don't even get me started talking about that. Definitely, but as I said, I definitely want to thank you for coming through.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. I'll be on again soon, I hope. Take
Yes.
care.
Dad, you got a last word?
No, I think he said his fashion said it all.
Okay. All right.
You
So
got to vote on the what?
June
June.
26th.
Wow.
June 26th. Please get out and vote. So definitely want to wrap up here. Of course, Radio on Fire broadcasts reach over 278,000 viewers per month. Advertise your product, service, or event on Radio on Fire by sponsoring any episode of any show, starting as low as $50. Visit radioonfire.com/promo to get started. Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
That's great.